I would recommend this book. Um, to start, just to get it out of the way, this is not primarily intended to be an explainer of any sort on Heidegger or his philosophical project. I do briefly discuss my understanding of the project after reading this book at the end of this video, but again, that's not primarily the function of this video. This is specifically a review of the very short introduction series piece on Heidegger. This is also the first time I read a book in the VSI very short introduction series, and it was great. I would recommend if the rest of the books in the series are like this, I would recommend them. I'm definitely gonna check out a book in the series for other philosophers or anything else that I'm just trying to get into that I'm not very familiar with. Um, it was great. So yeah, the book itself, before I get into Heidegger, very, very well structured introduction. It did what it was supposed to do, which is before I read the book, I didn't know much at all about Heidegger. Just a few things in passing from, other things I'd read or when he'd come up in conversations with other people. But really not enough of an understanding of Heidegger to write home about. But by the end, I feel fairly familiar with his project, with him, enough at least to discuss, enough that, if I had to read some book, I'd feel quite comfortable reading something of Heidegger's after this, which I may do. Also, at the end, what I really appreciate is there was a section where it suggests further reading, which a lot of nonfiction books have. But I really like this because A, there were suggestions, B, it was sort of discussed what each of those different books had to offer. For example, there's a couple of things in this book about Heidegger's philosophy that I drew parallels with Wittgenstein with. So there's a specific recommendation that address sort of commonalities and differences between Heidegger and Wittgenstein. So that's something I might check out in the future, for instance. So yeah, overall, the book, the way it's structured, it serves really great as an introduction. And if you're trying to get into Heidegger, I would definitely recommend it. Although again, I'm by no means a scholar of Heidegger. So yeah, it starts off, it gives you some context on Heidegger, his life, the time period he was in, sort of his intellectual background, his, with Husserl, with others, he's into Nietzsche, he's into Holderlin. It does not go into sufficient detail over some things, such as some of his later political affiliations. It sort of briefly touches on these and makes it seem like, oh, he did what he had to do. It was a difficult time period, which I've looked into this briefly, and that's not what the video is about, so I'm not going to go into too much depth. But apparently, more recently, as in after this book was written, they found some notebooks of Heidegger, and it's not looking good. It's not looking good. But I didn't know that before. So, anyways, now I'm just going to briefly go over my understanding of Heidegger's philosophy as I got from this book, and with a couple of cursory Google searches here and there as well, which I often do. And if you are someone who's familiar with Heidegger, then how correct I am or amn't is probably a good litmus test for how good an introduction this book was, or for how good a reader I am. But as I see it, Heidegger's project is primarily concerned with ontology, so with capital B, being, so the nature of being or existence, rather than with the specific phenomenon of beings. So with capital B, being, rather than small b, beings. He's generally averse to things like epistemology, with which there's a great quote. He felt that it, quote, continually sharpens the knife but never gets around to cutting, which is a great line. Like Aristotle, he seems to think that ontology must proceed from some exemplary or some exemplary type of being that has sort of lexical priority or some right to be the starting point for where we discuss being. The difference being that for Aristotle, this exemplary being is God, whereas for Heidegger, it is Dasein, which I'm probably pronouncing incorrectly, but shoot me. So, what is Dasein? Dasein literally means linguistically something like there being or there is or being there, but essentially he's referring to man, capital M, man, humans. Dasein is that being which has a preliminary or a priori understanding of being, and hence can ask what being is. So the fact that we can ask the question of what is being, what does it mean to exist, yada yada yada, the fact that we can ask this question as humans, it shows that we have some implicit understanding of being, the fact that there is, capital B being. And that's sort of what defines Dasein in some sense. And this is another quote from him. Dasein is an entity for which in its being, that being is an issue. Which sounds like a tautology, but I think kind of highlights what he's going for here. So why Dasein? So why is Dasein the exemplary being? Why is it sort of the focal point of Heidegger's philosophy and his project? So there's a quote here: Dasein and the world are not two distinct entities that can vary independently of each other. So I think the reason it's such a big figure in his purview is that Dasein is a being that exists in the world, but is also able to interrogate its being in that world. So Dasein, as much as being that can interrogate being, is in some sense the ultimate, or rather the only arbiter of being itself. Without Dasein, there may be beings, but no being. There is truth only insofar as Dasein is, and as long as Dasein is. So he gives an analogy at some point. I actually forget if the analogy was Heidegger himself or Michael Inwood, who wrote the introductory book, of sort of an eye, which the eye sees everything in its view, in its visual field, but it is not itself fully part of that field. Which is an interesting way of thinking about it. So, and I think Dasein is similar in that it's in the world, but it's also able to cast its light upon the world and look and reflect and interrogate its place within that world. Which is why, for Heidegger, it makes sense to start with Dasein in its experience when you're interrogating ontology and being. So then there's the nature of Dasein, right? So Dasein is man, Dasein can interrogate being, but what exactly is the point where we're getting at here? What is the nature of this being? And for Heidegger, Dasein's being is care. And what he means by this is not just, oh, we care about each other, but it's defined by three things, basically. One is Dasein's facticity, or what he calls its thrownness. So Dasein is thrown into the world in contexts and situations that are outside of its own control. You don't get to choose where you're born, what family you're born into, what time period you're born, anything of that. But you just, the fact is you exist. You're just thrown into this world. That is A for defining Dasein. B, you have Dasein's existentiality, or its relationship with death, or the fact, or what he uses a lot of big German compound words. One is being ahead of itself. So Dasein, in a sense, is defined by its death. So Heidegger's magnum opus is this chunky volume called Being and Time. And so we're physically exist in the world, but we also are temporal or historical beings, right? We exist in time, and we cannot control the fact that we exist in time. We are born at a certain period of time, and a certain fact for everybody, for all Dasein, is the fact that you will die. So Dasein is a being that is aware of his death, that is crucially aware of his death, and defined in some sense by this death. As a result of being aware of this death, Dasein thinks about this death, and its possibilities and the way it exerts itself is defined by the awareness that it will die. And so there's this good quote of his where he says, Dasein confers wholeness, dying confers wholeness on Dasein. So that's a secondary fact of what Dasein is and what is meant by care for Heidegger. And then third is what is interestingly referred to as fallenness. And basically when Dasein is not being authentically Dasein, but is rather acting in accordance with Das Man. So that's the a bifurcation he makes between Dasein, which is authentic existence for man, for humankind, or just authentic existence, and Das Man, which is, rather than your true self, it's the they self, right? So the self that, in T.S. Eliot's poem, Love Song of Alfred Prufrock, he says, to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. So that's Das Man, is when you are operating to appease or to fit in or just according to societal norms, rather than actualizing your own potentiality or your own possibilities. You're operating not as your true self, you're operating as a sort of they self. So you're not being real, you're being fake, you're not being authentically yourself. And this results in you not really being Dasein. You're not really existing in the way that you can or should. So you're kind of fallen in a sense. So these three aspects of our experience are what Heidegger refers to as care. Um, and I accidentally skipped ahead to the next slide, but we'll go there. So again, I'm not going to get too much into depth into his project. A, because that's not, again, it's not what this video is about. B, because again, I only read an introductory book, so I'm not really the person to be talking about it in the first place. But my 2 cents, based on what I've read, is it seems to me that Heidegger is sort of, his whole project is just him trying to configure religion without having to resort to the existence of God. So, and you can see a lot of this in the way he structures things, the things he cares about, and even the language he uses, right? The fact that he thinks, okay, man is thrown into the world. It's a very strong parallel to religious language, and not just any specific religion, in pretty much all religions. We're thrown into the world. Oh, Dasein is defined by the awareness of his death. These are all very strongly religious concepts. And even the fact that when you're not being your when you're not being your authentic self, when you're being inauthentic, when you're operating according to the they self, to Heidegger, you're fallen. And the imagery of fallenness is also very, I'm sure everyone is aware, it's a very religious imagery to be using. So Heidegger's whole project, which is why I also highlighted the difference with Aristotle earlier in the video, is for Aristotle, he's concerned with being, and that being starts with God, whereas Heidegger starts with man. So he's sort of, but he's nonetheless seems to be doing all the same things. He's just trying to find a way to do it without having recourse to God, which is interesting, question mark, funny, question mark, but yeah, that is just what I got from my brief exposure to Heidegger in this book. Let me know if I'm wrong. I'll probably be reading more of Heidegger at some point in the future, not the near future, because I have other things I want to read. But yeah, I'd love to hear from anyone who's more aware, more familiar with Heidegger. And once again, I would strongly recommend this book if you're interested in learning about Heidegger. That's as someone who's a non-specialist. And based on my experience with the very short introduction series, just based on this book, I would recommend the series in general.